speaker today. As those of you who have attended in the past, over the course of this month, we're celebrating the 120th anniversary of the State Historical Society. And today, here, July 12th, we have a wonderful presentation by the president of the International Society of the Daughters of Utah Pioneers, Maurine Smith. As Director of State History, I've become acquainted with Maurine in the last 3 or 4 years, and we laugh a lot and talk about history and have some really wonderful stories to tell, some of which I hope she'll tell today to all of you. Maurine has been the president of the international organization for 6 years. She's been on the board of the board of the Daughters for 25 years. And she's been a card-carrying member of this organization for nearly 40 years. There's so many wonderful stories and things that I hope she'll share. It's not a secret now that Maurine is retiring in October, which makes this speech and this presentation even more wonderful and significant. So with that, please, if you would, give a round of applause to Maurine Smith, President of the DUP.
Thank you, Brad. Well, it's my privilege to be here with you. I would, this looks like such a fun thing to do. Just come and eat lunch and listen to more stories and more history. I'll start off with telling you a little bit about Daughters. Some of you probably know as much as I do about it since you're in the field. The Daughters organization began on April 11, 1901. And what spurred this, the lady who started this organization was Annie Taylor Hyde. She was the daughter of John Taylor, who was at that time president of the LDS Church. And, you know, in 1897, yes, was when they had the big Jubilee. And that was celebrating being in the valley for 50 years. And so they decided that was a Jubilee year, they should have a big party. And so those that were in charge, which would have been Brigham Young, and those surrounding him, Mr. Clausen was the one that did most of the contacts, and he sent out letters tried to send out letters to all of those pioneers who had come into the valley in 1847. Because at that time, those were the ones that were the pioneers. If you came out any other year later than 47, why, you were just part of the crowd. So, so he contacted all of those that came in that 47 and asked them to be in attendance, if they could, to this big party. And it was a party for 2 weeks. I mean, we do pretty good for our Days of 47 celebration, don't we? To extend it as far as we can. But that celebration was for 2 weeks, and they didn't have a parade just one day. They had a parade almost every day. And they just had a big celebration. But along with the people coming, he wanted them to bring whatever artifacts they still had of coming in that particular year. So they're bringing their suitcase and stuff of all these, you know, when I look at that stuff that I've had in my house for 50 years, it's mostly junk. And some of them thought that that's what they were packing here too, was junk. In fact, when they contacted the people in, some of them that were in Arizona, Udalls, down in the Mesa area, and they invited them to come, and they says, oh, by the way, we do have what's left of the wagon that Brigham came into the valley in. Would you be interested in that? It's about ready to go on the woodpile. And so they says, no, put it on the train and send it up. We'll pay for the cost of shipping it. Just get it here. We want it. And so they did that. It cost the church a whole $10 to ship that wagon here from Arizona. And we have that wagon on the second floor in the carriage house at the museum. And it does look like it was just ready to go on the woodpile. But it was from this celebration that Annie Taylor Hyde determined that there was so much history here that was going to be lost. Because now these people that came in 47 were starting to die off. And their stories would die with them. So she felt like it was her responsibility to make sure those stories and that history was maintained and saved for the descendants so that they would know what went into that effort to settle this valley. So she called about 40 of her closest friends to her little bungalow home. It's one of the mansions up in the avenues. And invited them to help her start this organization called Daughters of Utah Pioneers. They drew up their constitution, and she says, by next time that we meet, I want all of you, each of you, 40 of them, to extend this same invitation to a group in your area. So that was how they started camps. And we call them camps and companies because they were reflecting upon the way the pioneers journeyed here. That each group was called a company. Each wagon train was a company. And each tent of people, in that tent was usually about 10 people. And so that was a camp. And so that's what we have referred to the organization as it has gone through the years. So our small groups are usually in a similar neighborhood, and they are camp. And then the camps within an area comprise a company, so that the company is within the boundaries of a county. So the county boundaries make our geographical borders. When there gets to be too many in a company, why then we divide. And so in Salt Lake County, we have 13 companies, and each of those companies have anywhere from 10 to 20 camps. So we have a good-sized organization just here in Salt Lake County. And then it's similar in Utah County and in Weber County. Each county has their own company and group of camps. Then we extend beyond the borders of Utah, because each of the ladies trace their ancestry back to those people that came to Utah and settled, or came through Utah. And we go with the boundaries of the state of Deseret, because it was a few years before they actually were called a state. I'm just glad it's not mine. I've done that before. And so we have organizations throughout probably about half of the states. We have members in all of the states, or pretty much all of the states. I haven't checked it recently. But most of the states we have members, which some of them, or a lot of them, are members at large because they don't have access to an organized group to attend meetings. At each of our meetings, we meet 9 months of the year, and each of these meetings, we have a lesson. We have a lesson committee that writes them, a group of 4 to 5 ladies that get together and they write the lessons for us, and we publish them. And you're probably well acquainted with many of these books that we started publishing in about 1932, as I recall. And we've been publishing one history book every year since then. We started doing that because, well, we needed money. And so by publishing a book, we could charge them for it, and that helped. But it was also a means of keeping track of these histories. And so each of our camps have the same history or the same lesson each month. And some of their big complaints is the lesson is too long. Well, that's by design. We're not just writing a lesson, we're writing a chapter of the book. And so there's 9 sections in each book. And so it's been a great work to get all of these collected. Also, one of the main assignments of each of our members is to make sure that the history of their pioneer is in our collection. And so we have, from what I've been told and understood, that we have the largest collection of manuscript histories of the pioneers of any place, any archives that we have in Utah. I don't know of any other state that has this type of a collection of their forebears that settled their area. Utah has such a unique story, doesn't it, of beginning. I mean, when our ancestors came here, they came with a plan in mind. They knew what they were going to do when they got here, wherever it was, and they knew they were going to build a community, an extended community. They knew what they were here for when they got here. And so most settlements throughout I would assume the universe or the world, is that people found a good spot to stop, and so they built. And somebody else came and stopped with them, and pretty soon they had a town. But the unique thing about the pioneers of Utah is that they came and they did it by assignment, didn't they? Brigham Young told them, you will go here and start building a city. And this is the way you lay it out in the checkerboard plan, so that it'll be easy to maneuver the town. You don't go in circles. You don't follow where the cows went. You make a plan and make that work. And so I'm sure you're aware of some of our visitors that come to visit here in Salt Lake at first have a little bit of difficulty figuring out how to get around. How do you understand 3 north and 5 south? And no, that does not go to work, is it? 3 north and 5 east. And how do we find this place? Since most of our streets are east, west, north, and south, it's kind of confusing. Once they get the checkerboard plan worked out and the grids, why then it's easy. And each town is laid out similar until it comes down through the generations and somebody decides to make a loop and a circle here and a drop there. Then you get on the fringes of town and it's anybody's guess where you're going to go. But anyway, so the daughters, that's the way they began. And when they got through with this celebration, this Jubilee celebration, then the pioneers are ready to go back home. But they didn't necessarily want to take their junk back home with them. And so now we've got the starting of a museum and no museum, because these people did not want to take that broken down wagon back to Arizona. They didn't want to take their washboards and all of these things that they weren't using now because they'd put them up in the attic. So they just left them. And so now this was part of the collection. And that's when Annie Taylor Hyde decided we've got to have a museum as well, besides keeping track, writing these histories. And so the museum part was shuffled around town a few times. And unfortunately, I don't remember all of the places. First place was there on, well, it was kind of in the tithing house that was there close to Brigham Young's home. The Hotel Utah wasn't there yet. And then they moved it downtown a little bit further. I think it was down in the Montgomery building. And then it got moved. The church housed some of it for a while. And then when the Capitol building got built, why then they had the Daughters of Utah Pioneers Museum artifacts in the basement. And the daughters had an office in the basement of the Capitol building until they were finally able to raise sufficient funds to build a museum. And now it's down to Kate B. Carter. And she was the one that wanted to have the museum on that 3-corner triangular piece up there at the top of Main Street. And the state says, but you haven't got room for any landscaping or anything. She says, I don't want to do landscaping. All I want to do is have a museum. And they couldn't talk her out of it. So that's, she had a hard time. There was a lot of court battles, a lot of contention about the neighbors not wanting the museum there and wanting them to take over that triangular piece. But Kate was the one that you didn't argue with. It was easier to just nod your head and get going. Governor, what was his name? At the same time in the 50s. Help me. You know who he is. What? Yes, Bracken Lee. Thank you. Thank you. He said there's only two people in the world that he was fearful of, and one was his wife, and the other one was Kate Carter. And he was kind of a bravado type of person. So anyway, they did determine to build the museum there on that triangular piece. And once they got it built, and you recall that the architecture of our building is an exact replica of the Pioneer Theater that Brigham Young had built shortly after they came to town and started as soon as they had a town. And I thought it was interesting to note that Brigham had a little bit of a thespian background in his earlier days, and he did enjoy entertainments and good entertainments and the theater. And so this was one of the things that he felt like was necessary in the community. People needed to have a time to rest and relax and to have fun. And so this is why he had them build the theater. And it was recognized as the best theater west of the Mississippi. Well, actually west of New York City, because it was, Chicago didn't have much going on yet. And so it was an outstanding theater. And the actors they looked forward to coming to Salt Lake and being able to play in that playhouse, in that theater. So when it came time, and I think it was it Heber J. Grant? That the theater was becoming into a state of disrepair. And they decided that it cost too much to do the repairs and restoration that it needed. And so they would just tear it down. The daughters were organized sufficiently that they were trying to save it. And because the daughters didn't have the funds behind them, that they couldn't afford to do the restoration or to buy it. So it did get turned down. And so that is why the building is built as a replica of the theater. And the daughters saved as many pieces and parts of it as they could. We have the box seat of Brigham Young that when he came to the theater. We have the proscenium curtain that was in that old theater, and they rolled it up and saved it. And some of the items that they used on stage, they have some of the instruments from the orchestra that played. And so we have those artifacts in the museum. But when our building finally got built in 1950, why that proscenium curtain, they brought it in and laid it down on the main floor and rolled it out. And they said when they took it down, it was so threadbare that you could almost see the actors through the curtain. You hardly needed to raise it. And so they laid it down on the floor, and your artists from the university and wherever came and did mending on it and repainted it, made it usable again, or at least so that it could be hung. And they improved upon the picture that's on the curtain. Have all of you seen that curtain in our museum? It's the triumphal, is it triumphal entry? Anyway, it's a scene an Italian scene in Naples. And in 1950, why the artist decided to improve on it, and they painted the Wasatch Mountains in the background. So it's a picture of Naples with the Wasatch Mountains, and it makes it most attractive. So you want to be sure and come see that. And it is hanging on that wall and has been ever since the building was finished. So when the building was finished and dedicated in 1950, why then Kate Carter promptly turned the deed over to J. Bracken Lee and says, we will rent it from you or lease it from you for $1 a year, and we'll let you take care of it. She was one smart lady. And so that's the contract that we still live by. And so they take care of all the upkeep of the building and the landscaping. And the only problem is she tried to arrange for parking better than it has. And they were supposed to purchase those other homes in back of us as they came up for sale and make those into parking. But somebody didn't read the contract late enough. You know, as the time goes on, you don't do that. And so we haven't acquired the parking that we originally should have had. So we have maintained, and they had, some of the things that were stored away are just amazing. And at this time they were able to bring them out and reestablish them. Two of these larger than life-size portraits, one of Brigham Young and one of Amasa Lyman, that we have hung in the lecture room. They had been brought from Nauvoo, folded up, and brought in the wagon, and never hung again until our museum was built. And if you look closely, why, you can see where those folds were, because they didn't roll them up, they folded them and put them in the wagon and brought them. And so those are a couple of the fun things that you see there. So our organization has continued to grow. We have around in the neighborhood of 23 to 24,000 members. Our organization in Canada is what makes us an international organization. We do have some members overseas, but they are members at large. But Canada is the only country that we have organized groups of camps and companies. So, and they are very good to participate. Do you have any questions that I can answer? That's the tricky part, is if I can answer it. Yes. Yes?
What's your favorite artifact in the museum?
Oh, I have so many favorites. I've been there long enough that they've almost got a place for me. One of my very favorites is this beautiful shawl. It's a crocheted shawl that belonged to Sarah Good Marshall. And her grandmother had given it to her as a wedding gift. She and her husband lived just in the outskirts of London, as I understand. And one day as she was coming home, you did want to know the story of her, didn't you? Okay. As she was coming home from work, why, she noticed a group of people standing around listening to a couple of men talking, and so she slowed down to see what was all about. And of course you know who they were. They were Mormon missionaries. And so she stopped to listen. And she was so enthralled with what she heard, she hurried home and told her husband about it. They were Baptists. And he was very upset with her, and he says, those are straight from the devil. You do not stop there again. Do not listen to what they say, because it's all straight from hell. And that's where you'll go. So, as I like to say, if you tell a woman no, you know exactly what she's going to do. So nearly every day she slows down, she sees another group, and she kind of slows down and listens to what they're saying. And so she starts praying for the Lord to remove this stumbling block from her path, that his heart will be softened and they'll be able to join the church. Well, one day she comes home and her husband has prepared tea for them. Ah, my husband has prepared tea? that means that's a good sign. Surely his heart is softened, things are going to be good. And so they sit down to enjoy their cup of tea and crumpets. Why, he's called to the door. And while he is gone, why, she hears this voice, distinct voice that says, "Sarah, switch the teacups." And so she does, she switches the teacups. And he comes back and they enjoy their tea. And as soon as he starts to drink his tea, he says, "Call your missionaries, call somebody, call the doctor, I'm going to die." And he suffers for a few days, but he does die. And now the stumbling block has been removed from her path. And she is finally able to start making preparations to join the church and preparations to go to Zion. She had 5 children and was pregnant with her 6th when her husband dies. And of course, at that time in England, women did not inherit. So she is working as a lady's maid, and she also makes ladies' leather, kid leather gloves to sell. And for the next 3 years, as I recall, she was saving her money as much as she could. Now she's got 6 children to take care of. And she saves her money, and finally, when they announce the Perpetual Immigration Fund that will help those more poor without the means, this will help them make the journey. They do have to make a down payment, so it's kind of like our credit card type of deal now, that they would make a down payment, and then the Perpetual Immigration Fund would see them on their journey to travel to come to Zion. She had saved enough to bring her and her family with the down payment. The down payment was $5 a person. So in those 2 years that she had been saving, she'd saved $35, which was enough for them to make that trip. Her friends tried to talk her out of it, telling her, you know, you've got 6 kids. For heaven's sakes, you'll probably never get all of them to wherever it is you're going. And some of them are going to die along the way. This is foolish. You wait until you marry again. You know, all of these reasons why she shouldn't do this. But one of the missionaries is overhearing this, what these friends are saying. And they come up to her, and this missionary says, "Sister Marshall, if you will go, I promise you that in the Lord's name, you will arrive in Utah with all of your children." And so there was no more discussion. She gets on the boat, and they head over. And finally she gets, you know, they have to go on the train to where they're setting up the hand carts. And this is the first hand cart company. And she goes right to Mr. Ellsworth and says, "Mr. Ellsworth, I'm going to be in your company." And he says, "Mrs. Marshall, I don't think so. You don't have a husband to help you to push that hand cart, and it's heavy. And besides, you've got 6 kids. I don't think so. You better wait till the next one. This is an experiment. We don't know how well it's going to go. So you better wait for the next one." And she says, "Mr. Ellsworth, I will be in your company, and I'll beat you to Zion." And she does. She gets her kids up an hour before the rest of the company, and they're ready and start out ahead of everybody else. And so when they arrive up here at Immigration Canyon, up on the hill, they get up early again and are ready to go. She says, "Wash up and make yourselves look good, because we're going into Zion today, and we want you to look good." Now you imagine how good they looked after 3 months on the trail. And as they start down Immigration Canyon, why, Brigham has sent up a bunch of cowboys on their horseback to go and meet them, because of course he knows they're coming in. And so these cowboys head up, and as they see Sarah Marshall and her 6 kids, why, they whoop it up and throw their hats in the air, and they're so excited to see this handcart company coming in. And it scares poor Sister Marshall. she gathers her flock around her and says, "Pray, pray, we've come this far, and now the Indians are going to get us." So finally the cowboys calm down, and they take the kids, one behind each of their behind their saddle, and take them in. But she says, "No, I will push my handcart into Zion." And she does. It's all downhill there. And so she comes into the valley by herself with her handcart and is forever known as the first lady of the handcart companies. And that shawl that we have of hers is the most curious lace, crocheted lace, that I've ever seen. And it's wool thread, a very fine, lightweight wool thread. And it's just such a beautiful filigree. We had the lace makers in our museum a year or so ago, and I asked them, "What kind of needlework is this?" Because I'd never seen anything like it. And they say, one of the ladies says, "I think I know, but I'm not sure. I'll go back home to Washington and I'll let you know what it really is." And when she sent me a letter about it, it is crochet. And it's done with a very large needle. I imagine it sounds like the needle is about the thickness of your finger, but it's so beautifully done. So this was something that meant so much to Sarah that she had to bring that with her. And of course, it didn't weigh much, so that was a good thing. It was better. It's good that Grandma didn't give her a big cabinet because she'd never been able to bring it. But so that's one of my very favorite things. Another one is the story about the Deseret alphabet, and showing that to some of our visitors. Of course, some of our school kids, some of them, not very many of them, know what the Deseret alphabet is. I'm sure all of you do. No, you don't? Oh my goodness, you've missed part of your education here. Oh, okay. Well, the Deseret alphabet came about under Brigham Young's instructions because they were collecting people here from so many different countries and languages. English is not the easiest language for them to learn. It's hard enough to learn to speak, and then to write it as something else, because every rule is contrary, has an exception to every rule. And so he says, let's come up with a code with an alphabet that is consistent. That when you learn it and you learn the sounds, it's always the same. One character doesn't have 6 sounds and another and have 3 or 4, So this was a smart thing to do. He had a committee of about 4 men that got together and figured this one out. One of the men was acquainted with the Pitman alphabet, Pitman shorthand. And so some of the characters look a little bit like some of the shorthand characters. Of course, you're so young, none of you remember what shorthand is. But so anyway, they did come up with that code, and they started to write some of the school books in the Deseret alphabet, because you could learn it. You could study that alphabet for about a half hour or an hour, and you could begin to read. And that way they could use their time more efficiently, instead of learning to read and write, to other things, was their thinking. Why waste? What do? We do 12 years on the English, learning to read and write it, and then you go to college and major in it. And it doesn't, English doesn't improve itself, but it does take a lot of work. And so this was the thinking, was it needed to be more simple for these foreigners to learn and to get acquainted with it. Well, they started to teach it in the schools. We have the first and second primer, and also part of the Book of Mormon is written in the Deseret alphabet. But then these Gentiles that came to town, they wouldn't do as they were told, and they didn't want to go to school and learn a different alphabet, so it didn't survive very well. However, you use it today probably more than it was used in that period of time, because it is installed in your computer. When Apple and HP were looking for a code for translation from one language to another, the Deseret alphabet was the code that they came upon. And it was already figured out, so all they had to do was install it. And so it's a basic database in your computer. And you can call it up, go to Deseret Alphabet Translator or whatever else, and it'll come up and you can translate from one language to another on that. Brad, you had a question.
I'm always interested in your different companies and how they manage themselves and what their meetings are like. Could you share what the meetings are like? And then also could you talk about the monuments program?
Oh, okay. In our meetings, like I said, we have a lesson. We have a lesson leader in each of the camps, and they choose from that lesson booklet whatever they want to share with the ladies. And so they have about a half hour to teach a lesson, and the booklet has around 48, 50 pages. So you know they're cutting it down way a lot. And I like to think they're giving a Paul Harvey version, and then they come by the book, and that is the way we go. We have a songbook that was a collection of all the many of the pioneer songs, and so we sing one of the pioneer songs and information on the song that we use. Then each of the ladies are invited to give a history of one of their ancestors, one of their pioneer ancestors, at each of the meetings. So one lady gives a history and they rotate through the camp that way so that they are constantly aware of their ancestry and their histories. What else? Monuments. Okay. Early on, they decided that we needed to mark the places where important things happened. And we don't put monuments up for individuals. Other people do that. We mark events. So if it's the first cabin in town, then we would mark that. If it's, one of them is the canal that we got 2 or 3 canals around where the irrigation system was started in the particular area. Where the first, down in California, there's where the first grain was raised. And, different things, but they were momentous events in the lives of the pioneers. Where the first primary was started in Farmington. Where the wall around the city was built. And there's a monument there that tells you about it. They built a wall around the city because it was more of a fort than it was a city. So it was a fort to defend themselves from the Indian raids. So these are the kinds of things that we mark. And we also have markers in some of the places in Europe where the first pioneers immigrated from. So there's one in Switzerland, there's one in Finland, I think so, in Germany, a couple in England, and then at significant places across the United States. So that we have almost 600 markers established by the daughters. And wherever we have a marker, why then it's got to be looked after and maintained. And so the ladies that live in that area are responsible to make sure that that marker is maintained, that weeds needs to be weeded, or if in this day and age those people that come and destroy that marker. And some of these kinds of people that take off those brass plaques and try to melt it down for the value of the bronze in them. And so we have tried to, our ladies even have to replace those plaques not in bronze anymore, but it's out of a polyurethane type of metal that has no intrinsic value, so that they won't get destroyed again. But there's a marker there at Warm Springs, at the old Beck Springs, as you come into town, that has been destroyed. And so we're just about ready to reestablish that one. And it's, they're not cheap, even though they're not bronze. They cost in the neighborhood of about $800 or more to get one of those replaced. But our ladies are very good about getting that assignment and taking care of it. One up here in the avenues on D Street, we got a call from a gentleman one morning, and he says somebody's trying to get that marker off of the plaque off the marker. They have already destroyed a couple of the rocks that makes up the marker. And so I immediately got my ladies in the East Bench, no, not East Bench, North Company, and told them what they needed, where it was, and go check on it and get it fixed. And so they were able to get that repaired before it was completely destroyed. So they didn't get the plaque off. So our ladies are very good about looking after these things by assignment, and that has made it very good. Yes?
What is like the future that the DUP is going to go through now? Like looking into the future, what are some things that you guys have been that you want to move towards? And my other part of my question is, what are you doing to kind of reach a younger? Is there anything you've done to reach like a younger generation, or to hear about it, or to like, I don't know, bring more of them in so that stuff isn't lost? Like the value of the information isn't lost as the older generation.
Okay, what we've done thus far, and I hope I've told my people that they've got until October when I go out to get this finished. We've been working on the digitization of our history collection and of the photos. And right now we're almost finished. Well, I said last week they finished with the photos. We'd already done the histories, but now we've got another file drawer full of new ones that have to be done. And so we're working with Family Search on that. And this is kind of an awkward thing because, Family Search doesn't charge for anything, but we do, because we're not part of the church, and so we have to maintain ourselves, and so we have always charged for these things. And so when it comes up on Family Search, the plan is now that when you call up, if you call up a history that comes from DUP, why then Family Search will reference you to DUP in order to get it, and we'll let you pay for it, and then you can download it. And so that's where we're going on that. And the photos would be similar. And so that's how we're trying to go forward. We found very quickly that with this day and age of computers, you got to either join it or get left in the dust. And so that's what we're doing there and trying to stay abreast of it. I have found that with our younger women, they are still younger when they get into their 40s and 50s. And then they start recognizing the value of it. Many of our daughters, their mothers will sign them up for DUP when they're younger, when they're in their 20s. And the girl says, I couldn't care less. But by the time they grow up to 40 or so, why then they start finding, I think I belong to that organization, and that sounds like something of interest now. And so I found most often they just have to grow up a little bit more, and then they're part of us. We are finding that we're getting more younger ladies because there is more of a drive, probably throughout the church, of being more aware and interested in this family history. And so we have, of course, we have always had the fourth grades coming through, and but we have a lot of youth conferences that come to the museum, and we will help them find if they give us information ahead of time, why we have histories ready for them to pick up. And so we can give them actually a scavenger hunt throughout the museum if they have items, family items that are in the museum, because we have the manner in which our museums are stored is open storage. So we don't have everything hidden away and just have displays that we rotate from time to time, as most museums do these days. We try to display nearly everything that we have in our collection. Things that we don't have displayed are items that would be impaired by the sun or the elements, you know, if they're on display all the time. Some of the textiles and some of the documents, so that some of the dresses and things that are just almost falling apart, you know, silk will deteriorate and things of this nature. So those kinds of things we probably have stored away. But almost everything in our collections are on display. And talk about display, we have, besides our large museum headquarters up here, we have about 130 satellite museums and collections throughout the state, throughout the western states. So we have one or two in Wyoming, some in Idaho, Nevada. We used to have one in Arizona, but I think that got...
I don't remember that one.
It was before your time.
Well, I don't know. I'm pretty old.
No, my dear, you are not. You're just still a kid. But so we have, you know, without DUP and our museums, you would not have all of your Utah history that we have today, because we have been in the business of collecting it and storing it probably longer than you have. How long has the Historical Society been in existence?
Well, 120 years, but actually, Maurine, about the same time you opened your facility, the State Historical Society turned over quite a collection of artifacts cared for by your museum. But you've been doing it 120 years, but earnestly for 50.
Okay. Well, we've been doing it earnestly for, that's over 100 years, isn't it? 1901. So we've got it 118 on us. So you did start a little bit earlier. But so it's good to be working together and sharing all of this wonderful information. I had a whole list of fun stories to tell you, and here you've messed it all up. You've just listened to me talk about DUP. Let me tell you one that I just love. This isn't even a pioneer. Well, he is a pioneer. You know, you all know about Jim Bridger. Do you know that he named, well, it's how Echo Canyon got its name. Jim would come down from his fort and come down into this area and trade with the Indians that lived down here. You know, Salt Lake area, this area was kind of a powwow place. This is where all the Indian groups would meet together and have exchanges and get along with each other for a minute or two before they started fighting each other again. And so Jim would come down this way through that canyon, but on his way, about evening was when he'd hit Echo Canyon area. And so he'd roll out his bedroll and get ready to go to sleep. And just before he goes to sleep, why then he says, "Jim, it's time to get up now." And then he'd lay down and go to sleep. And about sunrise, why then he'd hear, "Jim, Jim, it's time to get up now." And so he named it Echo Canyon. And if you believe that, why then I've got some more stories to tell you. If you haven't been up to the museum, come on up and let me show you around. We've got lots of fun things up there. And the one that kids always ask about, kids, I say, those that are 40, 50, 60 years old, they always say, "Do you still have the two-headed lamb?" And we do. So, thank you for this time. I hope it was a little bit of what you were looking for.